life. An early species finds itself in surroundings which suit it to perfection. No other animal comes along later which exploits the surroundings any better. Its cousins may move away to colonize different environments, or their own environments might change, and so they develop into slightly different creatures. But this creature, encountering no change, sees no cause for change, and so it plods doggedly on, an ultra-conservative. This formula of a simple worm-like body enclosed within a protective shell had obviously a lot of potential. Several groups of creatures in the very early periods were based on it, and one group in particular, mollusks, exploited it very well indeed. Today there are something like 80,000 different species of them.
Okay, so we stop there. Now, you would never have guessed, would you, that you could trace the ancestry of things with shells back to worms, because they look so completely different. Now you can understand a major leap, as it were. Speaking metaphorically again. Okay, now, these you've encountered before, the ammonites and so forth, which were at one time called snake stones, remember, in the first lectures? And I think I showed you that they are related to a living creature called the argonaut, which is the second picture down. But I didn't show you the nautilus.
For they spend most of their time in depths of up to 500 meters. But they can swim at any depth by pumping fluid in and out of their inner chambers, and so controlling their buoyancy.
It's so creepy. Nautilus.
Being so mobile, they need good sense organs, and their eyes, although they don't have lenses, are the best of any creature that we've seen so far. Their bodies have become modified into dozens of tentacles. Some carry sense organs to detect food, some are used in reproduction, and others to grapple with their prey, which is usually either carrion or lobsters or crabs.
So there we had a shelled animal with a little tentacly end on the front and good eyes. And, well, their descendants were creatures that you are more familiar with. Octopus, squid, cuttlefish, and argonauts. Now, it might be hard to see the relationship between that swimming shell and a squid, or a cuttlefish. But there is one that will show you the relationship. It's called the argonaut.
Of them still holding their eggs. For most of its life, the argonaut, like all other octopus, is totally without a shell. Only on this one occasion does it demonstrate its relationship with the nautilus so vividly.
It's only when the females lay their eggs that they secrete this shell.
Of them still holding their eggs. Demonstrate its relationship with the nautilus so vividly.
So these creatures have lost their shells, except for the cuttlefish, which retains a remnant of that shell, which we call the cuttlefish bone, with that rigid structure in the middle of the cuttlefish, which you probably don't get in a restaurant, but you will buy them for if they have pet birds, and they're probably some other uses to hang in there, and birds pick up the minerals. You often see them washed up on beaches, these sort of elliptical white, very lightweight structures. So, you may have heard before that an octopus is a mollusk, or the squids and so forth, but that may not have made much sense. But now you can see why they are classified as such. Even though they've lost the most recognizable feature of a mollusk to the average person, that is having a shell around it, like a clam, nevertheless they're mollusks. Okay, so back to worms. And as flatworms are very flat, roundworms are very round, segmented worms are very segmented. Anyway, these segmented creatures led to all sorts of other creatures which you will also recognize, such as crustaceans and insects, which were probably the first things ever to walk out of the sea onto the land. I was going to show you a video clip of this, but I couldn't get it. I couldn't extract it, sorry. The significance of this is that these segmented creatures deposited hard shell casings around their bodies for protection in the sea. But it just so happened that a hard exoskeleton is rigid enough for walking out of the water, something that it wasn't originally used for, but it has another use that some creatures use. For example, to walk out of the edge of the sea to lay their eggs in the wet sand, where they would be away from all the other hungry creatures in the sea that would try to eat their eggs. Horseshoe crabs still do this today. A creature with a rigid exoskeleton, it's a sea creature, and a very primitive one, a very early one. But they can walk out on land, and they lay their eggs on land, and then they go back to the sea. Their breathing apparatus, which are a series of plates under their shells, we have them here. If you go to Sungai Buloh, you can see some probably, or the type of them. They have these little breathing plates under their shell, which simply extract oxygen. There's some feedback over here. I'll stay away. They extract oxygen from the seawater, but these plates, if they're wet, can also extract oxygen from the atmosphere, which is why horseshoe crab can crawl around as long as it doesn't dry out and not die. But that's because sometimes a structure that evolved in the sea can work just outside the sea or beyond. And that way they can help many crabs and other creatures to walk out. So when you see a creature like a woodlouse walking around under dry leaves, this is a creature that is virtually unchanged from its ocean-living ancestors. Its shape and structure evolved in the ocean, where it has close relatives. Okay, now another kind of creature. Sea squirts. Another very primitive animal. Why are they called sea squirts? It's squirt. If you touch them, they squirt water out. Anyway, they're a very primitive animal that sucks in seawater, filters out food particles, and then spits it out. Very primitive animal. They're basically a blob of jelly. They're a primitive animal, but in their larval form, they have a simple notochord that is a nerve, a spine-like nerve bundle in the center of the body, which would later, in other creatures, evolve into the backbone. And thus we have the vertebrates. Lancelets, the creature in the top picture there, are one of the surviving early primitive sorts of vertebrates. Once the vertebrates had appeared, they diversified into many, many forms, and their descendants are still alive all around us, and they include us, because we have backbones. And that's where we got them from these primitive creatures that first developed backbones. So the first cartilaginous fish, that is fish that had no bones, they simply had cartilage over their bodies from totally sagging. The cartilage is up in your ears and nose and hold them rigid. Sharks are cartilaginous, which is why we only find fossils of their teeth and not their bones. Their bones, cartilage. But later, bony fish emerged. So that's where that structure came from. And of course the jaw, which I think was mentioned in an earlier clip. Moving ahead millions of years further, fish colonized much of the earth, freshwater, saltwater. And some fish which still survive are similar to these early fish. We call them lungfish. And they're the ones that evolved the ability to gulp air in order to survive in areas where the water was very poorly oxygenated. Remember, that was an adaptation of the swim bladder. Some of these also developed limb-like structures, not for walking, but for propelling themselves on the bottom, because they're not swimmers, and also to move around in extremely shallow water, perhaps to get away from predators. Okay, now this is an exciting fossil find made not that long ago. One of the first vertebrates to walk on the land. The insects and the plants have been on dry land for a very long time, and other types of creatures. This one is very interesting because it is the ancestor of most of the other creatures that live on land today. It's a fish that is an early amphibian. It swims, but its paddle-like, its paddles, fins, have developed. There were many families of these which had numerous small bones in their fins. And the ones that left the descendants, the ones that were the successful lineage, happens to have 5 long digit-like bones in their paddles. And that's why the vertebrates on land today all share the same number from the common ancestor, either tiktaalik or one like it, having 5 finger bones. And so we call them tetrapods, the 4-limbed, the 4-feeted creatures, which includes us, even though we don't really call these feet, but 4 limbs, let's say. This is a diagram showing the development from shallow living fishy creatures up to the tiktaalik-like creature, to ones that waddle around on land more of their life than they did in the water. Here's another one. And so fish walking on the land, it should not be unfamiliar to you, as we have it right here in Singapore. We have mud skippers. The mud skippers are not related, are not closely related to the creatures we're talking about. This is something that mud skippers have evolved the ability to come out of the land again on their own. These are separate lineage. They're fish, but they can walk on their fins, only the front ones, I think, and they can survive long after. There are advantages to doing this for fish. They can get away from predators. They can find food that's up out of the water that other creatures cannot access, and so forth. So to be a fish that's tied to the water, sometimes if you live, say, in shallow water near the edge, it may have advantageous to be able to scoop out just a little bit, nibble on some food that's just outside the water, not accessible to all the other fish swimming around, who are not shallow water livers, who don't have stubby paddles to allow them to push through the mud a little bit to get to the edge, and so forth. So, have a look at this. Tiktaalik and creatures like it, they both are the ancestors of all the creatures with 4 limbs, which you should recognize as the tetrapods. And so the amphibians were the first true land-living creatures, land-living vertebrates, tetrapods. But amphibians, as you know, are still tied to water very intimately. They have delicate wet skins. Many of them will die if their skin dries out. They still need, almost all of them still need to return to the water to reproduce. And some of them live in the water during part of their life. So one should not be surprised that there were water-living creatures, then there were creatures living right on the edge of the water, then there were creatures living just outside the water, but still tied to it. Amphibians, almost all of them lay soft, watery eggs that will not survive outside water. That's one of the reasons why they have to return to lay their eggs in the water, as they always had, as their ancestors always had. And from them, we've reached something that is not that far different from the amphibians, the reptiles, with a waterproof skin. Ooh, now that was very beneficial change, because then creatures could leave the water altogether. Far behind. In fact, maybe never even see water ever. The other thing that they developed were eggs with hard coverings that are waterproof, watertight. They still have a fish-like body. They still have their limbs. Their limbs are on the outside. If you ever see the next time you see a lizard or a gecko or something, look at its limbs. They're not underneath, like a horse or a dog. They're on the side. Which is why they often, they move in a snake, or actually they move in a fish-like manner. Their spine does this. Whereas a mammal, it's changed. Our spine is the spine of a dog or a horse, when they run, the spine is moving like that, not like a fish. Next example.
But how did snakes get that way? Well, there were no ancestors 100 million years ago, at the time of the dinosaurs, did have legs, rather like today's lizards. Doubtless, they were very effective runners. But some also started to burrow in search of prey. Below ground, legs are a hindrance, and over generations, they became smaller. Today, burrowing lizards such as skinks seem to be going through the same process. Many have tiny but recognizable legs. In others, the limbs have become nothing more than functionless flaps. In this burrowing lizard, the process has gone even further. The animal still has the face of a lizard, but its legs have disappeared totally.
Wow.
It seems that the ancestral snakes went through just such a process way back in geological history, some 95 million years ago.
So a bit like body shapes or structures evolving in the sea that happened to work later on land, snakes' body shape was originally used for burrowing underground. But some of them later came back up, and it turned out that that wriggly shape works there too, which is why there's so many snakes. First, and now even sea snakes. I think the most abundant snake in the world, if I'm not mistaken, is still subterranean. It's one of its common names is the flower pot snake, and they look almost identical to an earthworm. And most people don't recognize them. If you saw one, it would just look like a worm. I've actually only seen one in my entire life, and that was here in Singapore. One of my mountain bike rides, I saw one had fallen into a cement rain gutter, and you couldn't get out, so I was able to catch it. It was no bigger than an earthworm, but when you look really close, oh, it's not a worm. It's a snake with tiny, tiny little scales and tiny, tiny little spots where the eyes will be. I think they're blind, but in a tiny little mouth, they can, I think they eat the larvae of ants. Anyway, they're extremely widespread because they live in the soil, they're very, very numerous, very inconspicuous. Keep your eyes open next time you see what looks like a worm. But anyway, when I put it down, it slithered around just like, just like a snake. It's an amazing little creature. So of course, as you know already from the reptiles, one big family of those was the dinosaurs. And as you know, common legend is mistaken in saying that the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, because they didn't. They're still here. They're still flying around the science community. Right now, eating someone's chicken rice. That is a dinosaur, as you know. So, not that many steps away from these other birds. Remember, birds, they're scaly legs, laying hard-shelled eggs, just like many other reptiles do. Well, they're not technically eating them, they're not robot reptiles. In fact, I don't think it's even a valid group anymore. Then, another large branch off of the tree of life were these creatures called the mammal-like reptiles. These creatures were also warm-blooded, as some dinosaurs probably were, and they developed that unique characteristic of mammals to help regulate their body temperature: hair, body hair. These creatures are covered with hair, and their skeleton began to change somewhat in the way that they walked around. They decided to go more under the body than to go side-by-side method. But they still laid eggs, just like their relatives and like their ancestors. And in all the world today, there are only 2 mammals left that still lay eggs. The platypus and the echidna, which I have pictured there in the middle of the screen. They also developed another new feature, which I hope you're all perfectly aware of what that is. A feature definitive of mammals, the ability to produce milk. Now these very primitive versions of mammals, they produce milk too, but guess what? They don't have nipples. It just oozes out of the skin on their belly. And they have little pouches where once the baby, like a little worm, sort of burrows up through the mother's fur into the pouch. And this milk simply oozes from the skin. The baby just licks it off, or licks it off tufts of hair, perhaps. So now this is a shocker for you. Imagine these early creatures, these early mammal-like reptiles, living in burrows, probably, hiding away from those big, scary dinosaurs. Terrorizing the landscape. These little creatures with their furry bodies curled up, cozy in their burrows, maybe only going out at night, right? Their babies are not in eggs, right? They've hatched, but they are not ready-made to start running around, like say a baby chick. They need to be nourished. How? You can't go out and bring back a pile of leaves or a piece of meat for such a primitive little baby. What they must have done was got extra nourishment by licking mama's belly for sweat. The baby would then get more moisture, perhaps some minerals, and that would have gone on for a very long time. These little creatures that got a benefit from licking mama's sweaty belly. And over time, you can imagine that the females that produce maybe slightly more nutritious sweat, their babies did better. And eventually, that sweat became fatty sweat, which we call milk. So the next time you have some milk, remember what you're drinking. It's fatty sweat. Yummy. That's what it is. Modification of something that was already there, sweat glands. So, over time, some of these early mammals, as so often, again, diversified into many different forms and shapes over millions of years until we get to creatures that we all recognize today, like my cute little cat, isn't he cute? And eventually to primates. The most earliest version of those still alive are the lemurs. But when you hear primates, you probably think more of monkeys and apes. Like these we have here in Fatima. These two seem to be having a little kiss. Or something like that. And eventually to hominids, and eventually to humans. So, here's a little video clip it's very old, it's very primitive. Oh, it's YouTube, so it's probably not going to work. But anyway, this is an animation giving you an overview of the evolutionary process, and I'm trying to play it if it works. It doesn't. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know why it's not working. But you can Google it. It'll probably work on your own laptops, actually. If you click on the link, I think it might work. It's just that the computer here is not up to date, so I can't play it. But you can probably play it later. Okay, this is a slide given to me by my colleague Frank Wright, biology department, which he put together by hand. This is great. Nice little animation. This talk was actually about. Yes, so there you have an early terrestrial tetrapod, which, as I've just described, its descendants becoming the various forms of terrestrial animals that we are familiar with. Turtles and tortoises, lizards, crocodiles, birds, and so on. All of them vary in their skeletons, in other parts of their anatomy, and in their DNA. The striking evidence of their common descent from the same ancestors. Okay, I think we'll take your 5-minute break now. Come back. We'll start again in 5 minutes. Starting again, please. Okay, now I told you at the beginning that evolution is not a thing, but a process. I used a YouTube video on this thing, this one as well. I won't play it here, but you will all be able to play it, I hope, on your own. This is another film showing you something I've already shown you before about how the surface of the planet has changed, the plates moving on around and so forth. That's a big part of the That's a big part of the explanation that the early naturalists were trying to solve. In other words, why were things distributed in these very complicated ways? One of the major reasons for that is that the land masses have broken apart, often stranding some species and families in different places, sometimes bringing others together. For example, remember the great collision of North and South America, leading to massive wipeout of all the things that lived in South America. The separation of Australia, leaving it a world of marsupials, primarily, and so forth. Wallace line, they couldn't imagine the explanation for this, but eventually it was realized. So not only has life been changing and diversifying in all these different ways that I very, very briefly summarized today, but it's been happening in a world that's been radically changing. And we see the same patterns over and over again, that when things get cut off and isolated, the changes that accumulate in that population causes to diversify away from its ancestral population, whether that was, say, on a continent, for example. Which is why we always find the same thing, that remote places, especially remote islands, have lots and lots of unique species, because they have been isolated. So what would evolution look like if you could watch it, or see it? It's a bit like how Darwin wanted to know how climbing plants move, or how plants move in general. You can't see it, because it happens so slowly, remember? And he had to devise all those clever means of recording what the plants were doing, so that you could virtually see it in your head. And now we have time-lapse photography, and we can watch it by speeding it up. Same thing would be true for evolution. As Darwin himself wrote, if every form, means every living thing, which has ever lived on this earth, was suddenly to reappear, all would blend together by steps as fine as those between the finest existing varieties. Nevertheless, a natural classification, or at least a natural arrangement, would be possible. This is a very interesting thought experiment. Imagine we could zoom out from the Earth to, I don't know, maybe somewhere in lower orbit, and look down at the Earth, and it was possible to bring back every living thing that has ever lived and place it between its parents or progenitors and its offspring. Right? If you could do that, you could stand back and look at all of life on Earth, with every individual. What would the pattern look like? Essentially, it would be what Darwin described. It would be a very, very diverse branched tree, which, as you went back in time, would become narrower and narrower, down probably to this one original lineage. But But the bush or tree of life would be so complicated, and in some cases the branches even coming together, that it would look probably like a sponge. So dense, so tightly packed, and of course with countless millions of lineages dying out and going extinct. The point is that you can't see evolution with your eyes like you can watch a bird fly. But if you had this reconstructed collection of living things, and you were to walk along one of those lineages, let's say squirrels. If you were to walk along the line of one species of squirrel, you could walk for miles past all these dead squirrels. It's a nice image, isn't it? Walk past all these dead squirrels, and let's say we get to the present. Bing! There's a squirrel that survived today, right? And let's say it's a red squirrel. And then it's saying, yes, this is species X of red squirrel alive today. If you said, well, when did that species appear or emerge? It's actually a very difficult question. Because as you walked past its ancestors, just first its parents, grandparents, and so on, they would all look the same. You'd have to walk a long way before you gradually see that, oh, they're a bit grayer down here, but still almost identical. Keep on going, keep on going. The change should be so slow and so gradual. But eventually, you get to where it'd be, say, I don't know, gray or a completely different color than the living one. And then you would say, well, this is definitely a different species from the one alive today. Okay? But you would not be able to draw a line anywhere in that lineage of parent to offspring, parent to offspring, parent to offspring. But change so slow and gradual, you would nowhere see any change. It'd be so gradual. And that was the point that Darwin was making. That what we call species are in effect a label for convenience. And the point that he often stressed that a variety is, remember, is no different than an incipient species. A variety would be a little offshoot that's gone off and has been separated in another patch of forest, for example, and is a bit different, and maybe slightly orangish or something, or slightly bushy tail, whatever, some difference, so that we would be classified as a subspecies, right? But it could still mate with the adult. So, but if that lineage were to continue on and on and on for a very long time, you would then say that the squirrels at the end were a different species. But if you went back in time to shortly after it branched off from the first lineage we were talking about, you would see very little difference. So a very slow, gradual process that you cannot see. A bit like you can't really see the hour hand of a clock or a watch moving. Well, actually, I think you can technically. If you stand there long enough, you can sort of move them. Something that's moving very, very slowly. There's lots of ways you can determine that it is indeed moving, and you can tell what direction it's moving by measuring or taking pictures or lots of other ways you can tell that the thing is moving the way it is. It's just not visible because it happens so slowly. This is why evolution is hard for a lot of people to grasp, because it happens usually over a long time scale. That's of course the big visible creatures I'm talking about now. When you talk about bacteria, well, that's a very different story because they reproduce so quickly that they do evolve very quickly. In fact, things are evolving in you, all inside your bodies, all the time. If you've ever had a bladder infection, your bladder has been colonized probably by E. coli, which is actually not well suited to live in your bladder. But over generations, this is of course within a day, I think, a very short period of time, they evolve. They evolve to fit your bladder, and then they're living in there, and you've got an infection. Because now they're different. Because they evolved. Same can be done in the lab with bacteria. Leave them there long enough, say in a pot of boiled soup or something, they will evolve. The ones on the edge of the cup will become different from the ones that are living in the center and so forth. That's much more rapid. So, the basic principles. point about gradualism I've just made with this squirrel example. Every step or every change has to make sense, has to work for that living thing. Just like the creatures that I mentioned at the beginning, like the step from flatworm to roundworm, to roundworm with its body stuck in the mud with tentacles sticking out, to a roundworm in the mud with tentacles sticking out but with a shell around it, and so forth. Gradual. There's no such thing as evolving for the good of the species, as one sometimes hears, but only for the individuals one's actually talking about. Usually when you want to understand why things look alike, the answer is usually, of course you know about homologies, but the answer is usually common ancestry. Right? Like the wings of bats and birds are not, their wings are not derived from a common ancestor that had wings. They each evolved wings independently. Progress is not inevitable. Remember, that was the theory of Lamarck. Lamarck's theory, remember this, was not the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck's theory was that life progresses because there is an inherent law of progress in living things, driving them upwards and onwards. In Darwin's theory, there is no inevitable progress. Beings sometimes become more primitive, as I mentioned on the slide. But, of course, this picture that I've sketched of the last 3.5 billion years of life, more complex things have happened later, haven't they? So it does, at first glance, does look like a picture of some progress, in some senses, and yes, that's undeniable. But that's because we tend to follow the story of new appearances, and we exclude, as I have done today, the things that all stay the same, or very similar. So life on Earth is mostly microbes, even though we think it's mostly us, or mostly big animals. This is not the planet of the apes. This is the planet of the microbes. And it always has been. They are the dominant form of life on Earth, not us. When we die, they eat us. In fact, sometimes they're eating us right now. And we can do nothing to stop them. So that gives, by focusing on the big things, the megafauna, it does give a slightly false impression that all of life is going in this direction. But actually just some lineages have gone in this direction. Remember, if you panned way out and we saw all of life, including all the microbes just stewing around, there would be a lot more stasis, or the appearance of stasis, than this upward complexity might imply. So you see many things happening over and over again in the history of life. Like whenever there's some new territory or new niche appears in the world, you tend to find some new species will evolve to fill that space. This happens particularly after extinction events, and we've had lots of those. Occasions when lots and lots of things go extinct. Like, for example, when the atmosphere got filled with oxygen, lots of things got killed off. Or most famously when an asteroid or some other object slammed into the Earth 65 million years ago, and filling the atmosphere with dust, blocking out the sunlight. Lots and lots of things went extinct. But with so much of the world vacant, the surviving living forms had descendants that diversified and filled up all those gaps. We are the beneficiaries of that, because the mammals, which had been scurrying around hiding from the dinosaurs, now had not a blank slate, but a pretty clean one. And so there was lots and lots of diversification filling up those gaps. Another thing that's happened over and over again are, we always see examples of carnivores or predators and herbivores, right? We see this in fish and reptiles, in the world of dinosaurs or the marsupial mammals, the placental mammals. Again and again, we see this relationship in which you've got lots of creatures that eat, say, plants, and a few creatures that eat them. This has evolved over and over and over again. Right? If you're watching a movie about dinosaurs, you've got lots of herbivores there, there could be some predators coming on. If you go to Africa, you'll see something similar, right? That relationship of some eating others happens over and over and over again. One clue to how that might happen is something I saw in another David Attenborough film, which I won't show you a clip today. He was on the island of Aldabra in the Indian Ocean, which has a species of giant tortoise that looks very similar to the ones in the Galapagos, but they're different. This is a different archipelago of tiny islands, far, far away from anywhere. There evolved another species of giant tortoise. Well, their environment is very tough. These tortoises wander around all day at full tortoise speed, and they nibble grass and so forth. The whole place looks like a golfer's putting green, and absolutely mowed down almost to the ground. And the tortoises have plucked every blade of grass and so forth off the ground, and so it's almost like a carpet. But sometimes, of course, a tortoise dies. And bizarrely, the tortoises in Aldabra have become cannibals. So you're wandering along and they see a dead one there. Smells good. They'll go over there and start nibbling on the rotting body of another tortoise. Now, it might seem disgusting, but there's masses of energy, calories in that corpse. So you can well imagine that those tortoises that have adopted this rather revolting habit have actually done better than the ones that are trying to nibble off just a little bit of greenery from the totally mowed down environment that they live in. That's what David Attenborough shows you in the clip. But when I saw that, it makes me think of, wow, what if you had Aldabra there for millions of years longer, and it was much bigger? Maybe you would have, eventually, a species of tortoise that was no longer just a scavenger, but a killer. Can you imagine it? Killer tortoise. Just imagine them chasing each other down. The other one running, whoa! Okay, they would be very low speed chases, but, presumably, the killer ones would get a bit faster. And probably the other ones would get a bit faster too. So maybe they'd be faster battles. But you see, you can well imagine that if area were large enough, that some of these cannibals could become more specialized to always eating dead ones, right? If it was a large enough area, it was big enough supply of dead ones. And so there you can imagine the evolution from a herbivore to one that what we have today sometimes eats dead meat. You could imagine just one step further, one that just eats dead meat, if there was enough around, right? And then, of course, if you had a variety or a species of tortoises that only eats dead meat, eventually there's not going to be enough dead meat around. You can well imagine that they would sort of nudge some that are quite dead over the edge so that they could start feeding on them. So you can imagine in this particular case how a land of plant eaters, of herbivores, could evolve into a land of herbivores with predators. You see what I mean? You can imagine that in this case. And perhaps it's been like that in all the other contexts of life on Earth, where in the sea and on the land, again and again and again, predators have evolved. Because, look, the world is full of things that are good to eat. And that in itself is also a niche. Our bodies are a niche for other things to colonize and live on and live on. Okay, now I'm going to give you a few examples to help illustrate evolution using some particular examples. So, how did the birds in the Galapagos and other isolated islands, how did they get so tame? Remember? Please. Remember I said when human beings first went to the Galapagos Islands, the birds had no fear whatsoever and would just land on their heads or their arms or whatever. You hold your arm out and a bird would land on it. They had no fear. It would just kill them. And they did. How did the birds get like that? Because in millions of years there had been no land predators, and the birds had lost that natural timidity or fear of flightiness, that's okay to use that word. Why would they lose that? Because taking fright costs a little bit of energy, wastes a little bit of time. If every time the wind blows and some leaves blow off of a bush and you see that emotion through the corner of your eye, the bird goes, whoa, and flies off, right? Which many birds now do if they saw something out of the corner of their eye, right? Some rabbit bush, they fly off. They've wasted time and they've wasted energy. Whereas, as you know, there are always lots of different kinds are born. Always variation is always present. Those born that are a bit more cool-headed, a bit more lazy, I don't know, a bit less fearful, wouldn't be jumping off and flying off all the time whenever something happens, something falls or whatever. They would do a little bit better. The ones that always take fright. Remember, didn't I tell you about the example of the starlings in my back garden in Cambridge? Every springtime it happens. Those gangs of starlings were walking through the grass, strutting their stuff, and my cat would leap out. And most of them, even before the blades of grass had moved, my cat initiating its leap, they were off. There's always one, sometimes one or two. Didn't take fright, or didn't take fright quickly enough. They're dead. They're being mowed down every year. They would evolve in that direction if there were no predators. So if those birds were on the Galapagos, the ones that are born every year that are more easygoing, don't take fright, wouldn't be killed off. And they would become more numerous than the ones that are easily spooked. That is how, over time, tame creatures evolved on the Galapagos and other isolated places. So we've seen the same kind of thing happening over and over again. And that's why. Here's another one. Flightlessness. This is just one example. There are many, many kinds of flightless birds. And this often happens on islands, on isolated oceanic islands, without land predators. Because many kinds of birds can give up flying. After all, flying is a very extreme thing to do. Their bodies have to remain extremely light, extremely delicate. They have to have very good feathers, which have to be kept in good condition. They have to have muscles that are able to fly. There are lots of weight and other sacrifices in the body that are necessary to keep flying. If it's not necessary to fly away from scary predators, a lot of birds will just not bother, especially the cormorant, like this one, which just walks to the edge of the shore and plops in and goes swimming and catches fish, and then returns home via swimming and gets out. That's why you've got the bird on the left, a flightless cormorant of the Galapagos. It arrived there on wings. Its ancestors were like normal cormorants in the middle, which can fly. But in the Galapagos, there was no need to fly. The food was right there in the bay. There was nothing ever coming running down the rocks, snarling with teeth about to eat them. They never had to take flight. And they gradually lost it. Penguins, flightless. Right? And then of course there are lots of big ones as well, like ostriches and the extinct moa, or moas, there are many kinds, which lived in New Zealand. And as you remember, they did great because New Zealand had no land predators, and so they evolved not only from lots of flightless birds, the kiwi still survives today, but lots of kinds, including some really big ones, like these giant ones. And then of course we arrived there about 1,000 years ago, and we killed almost all of them, so they're extinct. But you should not be surprised if, let's say for example, a thought experiment. If we were to discover a new island out in the ocean somewhere, really, really far away in the Pacific, nothing, thousands of miles, you should predict that it will have a high proportion of unique species that live only there. You can predict that would happen, because it's been the case everywhere else where there's a remote island. They will have a high proportion of unique species that don't live anywhere else, but they will be related to things that could get there by natural means, by drifting or getting blown down in storms or whatever it is. Okay, this is my own photograph. The collared dove, my apple tree, well away from my cats. Now, the collared dove is one of the most common garden birds in Britain today. About 60 years ago, no one had ever seen a collared dove in Britain. They did not live there. They're not native there. And Britain is probably the most densely, how should I do this? Probably the country with the highest density of bird watchers of any country in the world. So there's absolutely no doubt that there were no common doves there before 60 years ago. Well, how did they get there? The population of this species over the last 100 years has migrated, the population has extended its range over the last 100 years or so through Europe. During the Second World War, they were almost all the way over to the English Channel. Every year they were seen further west. These birds have simply been extending their territory. And eventually they crossed over into Britain, and they are doing very well, and they've displaced other species. The point of this story is that we often talk about things happening in the past, animals migrating or colonizing new continents or going extinct and so forth. But the process is not simply something that happened in the past. We're in it. This is it right now. Evolution is happening right now, exactly the same as it always has during that lengthy lineage of squirrels I told you about before. It's happened at the same speed as happening right now. You look around and it's hard to see it because it's happening in such a slow time scale. Here's something that people have observed in the last 60 years, that this species has widely extended its range and it's changed the shape of the living world, at least in the bird world, simply because it's migrated. So things are still changing. They always are. Now this is a very famous example which I've saved until now, which is the peppered moth. In the two lower photographs you can see, my laser pointer is still broken, so I'll use a mouse. Both of these photographs have two moths. See this one? I'm circling it with the mouse now. It's very hard to see, isn't it? There's a peppered moth on a tree with some lichens growing on it. You see these are lichens growing on the tree. This is a black moth. Same species. They were almost always this color. Well, here you can see one clearly on this side, okay? The peppered moth always looked like that, but every once in a while there was a black one. Well, during the 19th century, the factories and homes and so forth were spewing out so much disgusting soot from all the coal fires and coal factories and so forth that large parts of the landscape were blackened with soot. The environment changed. In fact, it was so bad that even if you hung your washing out on a bad day, your white washing would be sort of grey and dingy from all the disgusting soot that was in the air. What was observed decades later was that these moths, which were a well-known common moth, these whitish peppered moths, were no longer whitish. They were black. They had changed in just a few decades from this whitish form to the rare blackish one had succeeded that. Because, and that's what these two photographs represent, left a clean, normal tree covered with living lichens, and these moths, the black ones, were conspicuous, more often picked off by birds, whereas the others were well camouflaged and did just fine, thank you very much. After everything got black and disgusting and dirty, the trees looked like this, the one on the right. And guess what? The moths stuck out. The birds ate loads of them, but the occasional dark ones happened to do okay. So after not that many years, the peppered moths were black, or darkish, like this. So this was an early example of recording the change of the species through causes that we can understand. The environment had changed and the moths had evolved from whitish moths to black. But then it went back again with the change from burning coal, when this was banned and reduced and so forth. The blackness of the environment gradually went away. The environment got cleaned up. And guess what happened? All the black moths now stuck out again. And guess what happened to them? Birds had a field day, literally. Chomped them all up, and guess what happened? Over time, the moth evolved again into a lighter form, better camouflage. All of this was observed by scientists. So, very interesting example. You may sometimes encounter on the internet creationist claims that this example is flawed. In fact, some people have even claimed that this was faked, or that the research was dodgy in some way. I once had the honor to know a scientist at Cambridge named Mike Majerus, who was, I think, the world's expert on the peppered moth, and he gave a very interesting talk showing very clearly that these claims were ridiculous, that the differential predation by birds was undoubtedly the only explanation for the change in these moths. They did all sorts of clever things, like they would release them and then they would have traps and collecting them on different environments and so forth. Okay, here's another example. Pretty different. Okay, just to give you, I hope, a better rounded view how life on Earth works. So, can you tell me, have polar bears ever eaten penguins? What? No. Someone said no. Why not? Because they live in different areas, yes. That's putting it mildly. Polar bears live in the Arctic, the north end of the planet, and penguins live in the Antarctic, on the other side of the globe. These are two types of creatures that are adapted to living in snowy, icy cold places, which are largely white, right? But independently of each other, on opposite ends of the globe. And because the intervening area is not suitable for them to live, right? They have to go to the temperate and the tropical zones. They never possibly get it even a fraction of the way to the icy other end of the world, which would suit them great if they could get there. But they have not, because there are barriers in the way. Right? That is, just as I've described how the surface of the Earth has always been moving around, natural barriers are also always a constant part of the picture. And things are where they are based on whether they can live there or not, whether they can naturally get from A to B. The barriers will limit where they can go. So polar bears, I don't think, will ever colonize the Antarctic, because they simply can't get there. Unless we have another snowball Earth and another ice age, and then they probably could colonize all the way down. Same with the penguins might be able to colonize all the way up. Farthest north penguins live actually is the Galapagos. So, hence to this slide with this very ambitious question. What is life anyway? Think about it. Take that God's eye view again, pan way out and look at the world from the outside. Okay, not this usual view we have, but look at it from the outside. What is it? What is life on Earth? From this perspective, of course, the Earth is a massive lump of stone and iron, and so forth, with a little film of water around the edge of most of it. From that perspective, very tiny little bit of water. And what else is on this planet? Is a tiny, thin little layer of scum on the outside, which is life. Life on Earth is a complex chemical process based on the extremely rich chemical mixture that exists on our planet, but doesn't exist on others. the other planets that we know of in our solar system do not have such a rich mixture of chemicals. They don't even have water on them. This planet has an abundant mixture of the right chemicals, some of which work in a natural process in which those chemical processes or lineages change over time. That's how an alien would describe what's happening on our planet, looking in from the outside. So we are at the end of endless lineages that go back 3.5 billion years of a chemical process that is unbroken, as this process ever breaks, which is called extinction, then that lineage of chemical change comes to an end. So you are the end product of a continuous chemical reaction that has been taking place in your direct line for 3.5 billion years without a single break in it. Because every one of your ancestors was successful in reproducing before they died. You can say that with a certainty. None of them died before they reproduced. Otherwise you would not be here. Okay, and now a last word from our friend Wallace and Sir David.
Wallace's notion on discovering such marvels surely be echoed by all of us who follow him. This is what he wrote. I thought of the long ages of the past, during which the successive generations of these things of beauties have run their course, year by year being born and living and dying amid these dark, gloomy woods, with no intelligent eye to gaze upon their loveliness, to all appearances such a wanton waste of beauty. It seems sad that, on the one hand, such exquisite creatures should live out their lives and exhibit their charms only in these wild, inhospitable regions. This consideration must surely tell us that all living things were not made for man. Many of them have no relation to him. Their happiness and enjoyments, their loves and hates, their struggles for existence, their vigorous life and early death would seem to be immediately related to their own well-being and perpetuation alone. Indeed so.
Indeed so. Wallace and Darwin and many of their contemporaries were not just people who studied the living world and who tried to solve the many puzzles that it presents, but as you can see from that passage that Wallace wrote, they were also very passionate about the living world. They passionately loved living things. They loved birds, animals, and so forth. It was their passion and their hobby to study how do these things live? How is it that they've come to live where they live? How do they go about living and dying and so forth? And ultimately, how did they come to be? Where did they come from? And the answer that Darwin and later Wallace came up with was the one that is still accepted today. That the different kinds of living things on Earth are descended from earlier forms. Descent. Descent with change. Darwin called it descent with modification. Descent with change is another way of saying evolution. It's the same thing, just a different vocabulary. So, this story that I've told you over the course of this semester, all of these different workers studying the living world or the remains of what once living past worlds, fossils and so forth. Eventually, their work with lots of dead ends and so forth. Eventually, their work culminated in the story that you can now watch when you watch a documentary, or as I try to recount here, the gradual uncovering of the past of life on Earth, figuring out what happened, figuring out the order in which various things had appeared, why things had changed from one to another, why it is that certain structures exist, why these mysterious things are shaped this way or that, why is it that we have fingernails, why do men have nipples, and so on and so on. We've answered many of these mysteries, but as you know, science never ends, and people will go on figuring out more and more in the future. One can only hope, anyway. And so, I'll conclude with Darwin himself, going back to Darwin. And this is a famous passage I'll read to you from the last page of The Origin of Species. And it's a very famous one. And this is it. Darwin wrote in the conclusion to his book, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense being growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, aiming at the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And that's the end of this course. Thank you very much.